Secondly, it's a transforming city. Look what it says in verse 13. I put the verse up for you. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but seeing them afar off. See, it's a place that transforms. When you really say, like a hymn that probably would have been picked if we'd have sang long enough, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up in that place, that heavenly city. And once that great deposit of all that is important to us is there, and that's where our abiding treasure is, it's very transforming. It says they embraced this promise and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. That's the idea of both Peter and Paul both described their earthly lives as living in a tent. If you look back at Hebrews, look at Hebrews 11:9. They dwelt in tents. See, the idea of a tent is that it's temporary. And it doesn't mean we all should sell our houses and move into tents. What it means is that we should have that pilgrim and stranger. See, what's happened today is Christians are not, by and large, pilgrims. And we're certainly not strangers to the culture. In fact, we know more about the world's culture than we know about God. Right now, the average high schooler knows far more about pop culture than God. In church, that's saved. Christian kids know far more. I mean, did you hear these hymns? Nobody knows those hymns, but you do a common top 40 or 100. They know all the words to them because we're not strangers here. This is our home. And there's something transformational when you really take a Matthew 6 view that where your treasures are, your heart will be. If your heart is attached to property here, a lifestyle here, recreation, amusement, and sports here, this is where your heart and treasures are. And the Lord says, I want you to be a pilgrim and stranger here, and I want your treasures there. So Jerusalem is transformational. And finally, one more element. Look at chapter 12 of Hebrews. Since you're in Hebrews, you probably didn't even know how much Jerusalem's talked about in the book of Hebrews as a spiritual portrait. But why they were so interested in this heavenly city is because of what it says in Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. Now, last week when we looked at the sixth seal, that earthquake's coming to start the tribulation wrath of God. That earthquake shakes everything so that everything moves. Everything fixed on the earth moves. Look what this verse says. We have something that can never be shaken. Let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. You know what it's saying? Only grace can make me pull my tent stakes up. Now, you know, I've told this many times, but every time I think of tent stakes, I think of Prince Edward Island. We took our best friends from a church that we were pastoring in New England, and they had 4 little kids, and at that time we had 4 little kids, and we went camping, only they had never camped. And he was a high-powered investment banker that was making in the 6 and 7 figures back in the 80s. And so, I mean, they bought every camping thing you could think of. And he bought this massive tent, it looked like a palace. And he bought extra long stakes. And I said, Rick, you really shouldn't. You shouldn't. Those are too long. And he says, no. This is my family. I want to protect them. He brought a mallet, like for a circus tent. And he put those stakes around. And I had my tent up, and I pushed mine in by hand. I just went like this, and pushed them in, hand, so they were sticking out that far, because, you got to get them quick when it's time to leave and go on the ferry. And Rick got his mallet, and he just buried those things, every one of them. I mean, he lifted it way over his head and whooped them, and they were out of sight. Well, at 4 a.m., the day the ferry was coming, and we had to get to the ferry dock, he was out in the pouring rain, tugging. I think he left his tent on Prince Edward Island. It's probably still there because it was so attached to the earth. And did you know that's how we live our lives here? The Lord says we're supposed to be pilgrims and strangers and living in a tent, and we put our stakes way too deep. But look, if you're in chapter 12, look at what the Lord says starting in verse 22. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God. And Zion, Mount Zion is where Jerusalem is, so that's another way of saying Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem. The city of the living God, that's where we're going. To the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, and we've looked at that over the years, how many billions of them there are. To the general assembly and church of the firstborn, that's us, all of us who have been born again, who are registered in heaven. You know, it's so interesting. Would you walk up to a famous hotel that is always full and just walk in without a reservation? Never. You'd get online and make sure you could get a room there before you go there. We always register. I mean, would you walk up to an airplane, gate and just say, do you have room for me with no ticket? No. I mean, they wouldn't even let you buy security. You have to have a reservation. Look what it says here. Those who are registered in heaven. You can't get to heaven if you don't have a reservation. And you can only get your reservation here. But those that are going, look what it says. To God, the judge of all the spirits of men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than Abel. What is that? Abel's blood, chapter 11 says, cries from the earth. And it cries for vengeance because Cain slew Abel and his blood was crying out for God to do something about it. Christ's blood, look what Christ's blood speaks of. The new covenant blood speaks of forgiveness. See, that's what it's talking about. Those that are going don't have vengeance facing them, they have forgiveness. But don't refuse him who speaks. Verse 25, for they did not escape who refused him, whose voice shook the earth, verse 26. And then it says in verse 27, yet once more, the removal of things that are shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which can't be shaken, let us have grace to not put our tent stakes down here, to stay pilgrims and strangers, to not think this world is all there is, and to say, I have this place that I'm headed, and I want to be a stranger. I want to not understand. You know, the new thing is, really, really get into this culture so that you can reach. Get into this culture so you can reach it. And you know what it is? It is basically neutralizing believers. God said, no, I want you to be a pilgrim and a stranger to the culture. So they think there's something wrong with you, Peter said. But when the Lord is convicting them, they're going to want to be like you, not like they are. All that is tied to Jerusalem. And so the way to interpret the Bible correctly is to understand Jerusalem, the 5 levels and what God's planned, and especially the ultimate. God and history